Hello, everyone. Good evening. Depending on when you're watching this, it could be good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here. This is technically the very first event of our 10th anniversary season for the Festival of Literary Diversity. My name is Jill Richardson. I'm the founder and executive director of The Fold. I'm also an author, and I love these kinds of conversations. We're going to talk for about 60 minutes about the publishing process with a few authors that I'll give a little bit of information and talk a little bit more in a second. But before we begin, I just want to give a short land acknowledgement. The Festival of Literary Diversity takes place on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded Indigenous territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional homeland of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee nations. And it's always such a privilege for me to say those names, those communities, mention those places, because for me, my ancestors, I'm not actually able to trace their names, their locations with any kind of true precision. And so as a result of colonization. So really important for me to remind myself of the land that we're on, the reason we do this work, and the people we do this work for, to remember those who've been traditionally underrepresented in publishing and in Canada. To view captions for today's event, there's a button at the bottom that says CC, show captions, so you can click on that. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us here. You can participate in this event by asking questions using the Q&A box if you're watching through Zoom. If you're watching on YouTube, you can also post your questions there in the chat, and we will find magical ways to get it to me. Without further ado, let's bring in the rest of the authors. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. Our first author is Denise Da Costa. She's a Canadian author whose debut novel, And the Walls Came Down with Dundurn Press in 2023, was longlisted for the 2024 Toronto Book Award. Samantha Jones is a poet, editor, and earth scientist based in Calgary, Alberta. And Derek Mascarenhas is the author of critically acclaimed adult fiction and children's literature. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. We mentioned Sam is from joining us from Calgary and Alberta. I'm assuming, Denise and Derek, that you are joining us from Toronto. Well, I feel like, Denise, you're outside of Toronto. I want to say St. Catharines. Am I just
correct? That's where I'm joining you from. You got it.
Amazing. Derek's in Toronto. You're in St. Catharines. I'm somewhere in the world that's not important. But thank you so much for being here tonight, for being a part of this conversation. As I mentioned, some people are going to be watching this event live or sometime in the early parts of 2025, and some people might be watching it later this year. So we're going to keep that in mind as we converse. But the first thing I wanted to do is congratulate all three of you on your publishing history, your experiences. And I wanted to give a chance for each of you to share a little bit about your book, the most recent title, or the one that we'll be talking about in terms of Fold. And then I'll do a little bit more blurb after that. So let's start with Denise, if you could give us a little bit about your book.
Sure. My book is titled And the Walls Came Down, and it follows Delia Ellis, whose teen years were spent in Toronto in the 90s, and that's where the majority of the book takes place, and is told by her adult self as she revisits a lost childhood diary to relive her experiences growing up with a mentally unhealthy mom, and all the great things that come with childhood, first loves, and all of it. And it's completely based on a place that doesn't exist anymore. So, a bit of historical fiction.
Love it. Love it. Samantha.
Yeah, my book is called Attic Rain, and it's a poetry collection with New West Press that just came out in September last year. And it's about my experience living with OCD. And so it's got a mix of different things in there, form poetry, free verse poetry, visual poetry, and graphics as well. And so it's crossing a little bit of genres, autobiographical, as well as poetic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Mascarenhas. And first off, thank you for having us. And happy anniversary, 10th anniversary to Fold. So happy to be here. Yes. So I write fiction. I have an adult fiction book called Coconut Dreams. It's a short story collection about two siblings growing up in a very white neighborhood. And my more recent title, or that one was with Book Hug Press, which I'll talk about a bit more later. But and then I have two picture books over my shoulder, 100 Chapatis and The Mango Monster. I have to say it like that. I've been presenting to kids too much, but um, and th those are with Owl Kids.
Very cool. Well, this is really exciting for me because a little bit of background. For those of you who don't know, the Festival of Literary Diversity started in 2016, and the focus was celebrating underrepresented authors and storytellers. That was the mission. We were trying to sort of uplift and center authors who weren't being featured as much at literary festivals and all that good stuff. But of course, we recognize that there was like a shortage of authors from marginalized communities as well. And so one of the things that we built into the framework of the festival from very early on was opportunities to connect authors from marginalized communities with editors and agents, people who, Derek and Denise, I mentioned you're in close proximity to Toronto, where a lot of the publishing events and industry happen. But there's also folks who are marginalized geographically. Samantha being in Calgary, sometimes it feels like you can't make those connections, and really finding ways to bridge the gap to make sure more people are able to access publishing. And so I really wanted to give a chance for each of you to sort of share how an event at Fold kind of helped you get those first books traditionally published. And I'll start with you, Derek. We're going to go in chronological order. So we'll start with Derek and then Denise and then Sam.
Yeah, so it was one of the earlier years of Fold. I won't say which year. I remember, Jael, I got this question. There was a Fold trivia question in one of the virtual years, and I got it wrong. The question was about me, and I got it wrong about the year. Anyways, it was one of the earlier years at Fold, and I'd heard about Fold, and it was the first year I'd gone, and there was this. I heard about this writers hub. And I was at the stage of my career where I'd had a number of stories published. I've been working on my manuscript like for many years. I got into the place where I was starting to get ready to see like what's next. But I honestly didn't. It was all a bit of a mystery on like what to do next and what steps do I take how do I get this book published, which I've been working on for a long time published. And Writers Hub was there. It was this magical place where publishers and authors could connect. It was in Brampton, and I believe it's virtual now, but it's just this place where authors can connect with writers writers can connect with publishers. And my story was I went to the Writers Hub. It was a really kind of chill atmosphere. Like I don't know whose idea it was to like not have the publishers like sell their just make a place where okay, Jael. It was such a brilliant idea because not to say that publishers need to sell their books, but for that specific event to have publishers not selling their books, it's just a different conversation that you're having with the publisher. And I really got to have a great conversation. So I met my publisher of my Coconut Dreams, Book Hug Press. I'd met Jay Millar once before at an OAC event, but I reconnected with him there, had a great conversation, and then I also met for the first time Hazel Millar at the Writers Hub, and we just had like such a genuine conversation about they were super interested in my collection, and the whole like it felt like there's this like little moment that kind of blossomed, and then from there they were interested in seeing it, and so like when it was eventually ready, I sent it to them, and that was kind of the start. And like I just think back and like if there wasn't space for that conversation to happen, like it was just came at the perfect time. It felt right on so many levels, and so yeah, I'm really grateful for providing that space and making those allowing those connections to happen.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, it's again, for those of you who this may be new to you, you might not know a lot about Fold. So Fold typically takes place, and when we first started it, took place in person in Brampton for 4 years. That's it. All we did was in person. We had this writers hub where we would bring publishers in, and we had sort of like a fair style where you could go around and talk to different publishers. And then, of course, 2020 happened and we moved virtual. And since then, we've actually been building a very comprehensive experience with our programs to make sure they're virtual, which for us allows even greater amounts of accessibility. So I'll get Denise and then Samantha to share about some of the sort of new experiences or new ways that those connections are being made. And starting with you, Denise.
Sure. So funny thing is, Derek and I probably passed each other at the hub at that point because I was going to fold as a participant for from the very beginning. My friend and I, we were so psyched to go. And thank you so much for creating that space. And I'm sure you know now why you did it, because here we are, right? And my journey is a little bit different from Derek's because I came to read. So I actually had gone through the Humber literary program and was referred for one of the author series. But these are unpublished manuscripts. So understand to anyone out there that you're reading something that you've never read in front of anyone before. And you're reading to an audience of your peers and editors, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was my first opportunity to truly share my work and see it being received. And I did get like we don't call it a callback, but interest from a particular editor that was there. That didn't pan out, but it's still a very important part of my journey because it kind of tells you where you are. And I started pitching seriously after that event. And you never really lose contacts. It's a small writing community. And so my publishing experience came later on, but I would have met Derek shortly thereafter this happened. So it's really, really kismet how it all ties together.
And so was that the writer's court? Like, did you read it, the one that's like idol style?
Yeah.
So we used to, in the early years, the festival had this old museum. There's an old museum in downtown Brampton with a court. Like, actually, if you've watched The Handmaid's Tale, is it The Handmaid's Tale? Or it's a different one, Alias Grace. If you've watched Alias Grace, it's actually filmed inside the PAMA court. The court scenes are filmed in there. So we have this actual courtroom where we would get writers to stand in like the testimonial box and read their work to agents and editors who would then give them live feedback like they were on American Idol. So that's something we did in those early years as well. Samantha, you joined through Virtual Festival, I think, if that's correct. And I look forward to hearing a little bit about that.
Yeah, I love how the different elements of these, because I feel like I have a little bit in common with both of the stories. But so I started attending the Fold as an attendee just to listen and learn when it first went online, because I was in Alberta and Calgary. And at that time, in general, just the boom of availability of programming because of the shift to virtual platforms was amazing to me, because I was able to all of a sudden attend things with, world-renowned authors or free clinics or workshops. And all of a sudden it was like, wow, I have all these, resources right here. And so the first few years I went as an attendee. I think the first year I attended, the second year I actually had a poem. The second year I attended, which was 2021, I had a poem in the program. And then the third year I went to the virtual writers hub, where I ended up connecting with New West. And in that sort of space, I had New West in mind already a little bit as a publisher that I really wanted to go for. But a lot of the independent publishers, especially for poetry, they only publish so many poetry collections a year. And so sometimes it can be a while between when they're open for, unsolicited submissions, which is typically how poets operate. And so then they had been closed. And so I was thinking, like, this is my chance to ask without being obnoxious. Like, when are they going to open for unsolicited? And I was being a little bit coy about it because I didn't want to come off as annoying or anything. Not that I recommend that. Sometimes being direct is a little bit better. But in that case, I chatted with the folks at the booth, and didn't want to monopolize the chat. And I went away. And then actually later on that same day, I got a follow-up message from an editor who saw me in the chat and said, "Hey, I saw you were chatting here earlier. Do you have a full manuscript ready? Do you want to send it to me?" And so my editor was Jennifer Bowering Delisle. And so we ended up connecting that way. And we had already been sort of in the same literary circles in terms of social media connections and things, but we had never met. But having that network and then seeing each other in a few different places come up, I think really helped that be more organic, because, you know, we recognized each other's names. You know that, okay, this is a person that you can trust and is genuinely interested. So it's that combo of the networking session, but also having put in that time to be present just in the scene and grow those relationships authentically because you want to be there. So I think there was different layers of that in my experience.
Love that. Oh. I should mention too, unsolicited, I think means when they're just open to like anybody pitching a manuscript. And so sometimes there'll be closed submissions and they won't be accepting anything. Sometimes they'll only take submissions from people they've actually asked for work from. And unsolicited, another word that people will talk about is the slush pile, right? Where you're submitting it sort of and being considered alongside however many people they get pitches from. So thanks for mentioning that. And just a little bit about the virtual that Sam was talking about. We have virtual booths for editors and some publishers that really support the Fold set up virtual booths, and they have information, and then they do what's called now roundtables, where on the Sunday of the opening day of the festival, you can actually pull up, like click on a little chair and join a little mini Zoom. And sometimes the Zoom has a couple people in there and they're all asking questions back and forth. Sometimes it's a one-on-one, but it goes on for about an hour and a half to 2 hours of drop-in time. And we do that every year. We'll be doing that again this year. And that's, you know, I always say one of the, other than Pitch Perfect, one of the best ways to make connections. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the publishing experience. So you talked about how you got your book published. We're talking about traditionally published experiences, all three of you. Really cool that all three of you, it's different kinds of writing. Actually, Derek, you have a children's book, short story collection, we have a novel, we have poetry, we've got it mostly covered. So what was the publishing experience like? And you know, what did you sort of learn in that process? How long did it take? Like, lots of people just want to kind of know, like, what happened after you went to the event and they were like, we want to see your book. Maybe Denise, we'll start with you.
Well, I ended up pitching. So I was pitching, trying to get an agent, trying to get an editor, and it didn't work out. And I crashed and just said, forget it. I'm sending it out to publishers. So Dundurn is the one I ended up working with. That's the publisher I heard back from once I had gotten but that process from getting out of the slush pile to submitting the manuscript to getting an actual yes was about 8 months.
And that
then
was after, was that exclusively for the pitching directly to publishers, or does that include when you were also looking for agents and then sort of thinking like
just the direct to publishers? Like, actually, that was 8 months from the time she kind of said, I think we're interested. Right. So it doesn't always come as just in case of one thing. They come back to you with a solid yes every time. I don't know if Samantha or Derek, you had that experience, but for me, it was like, we're thinking about it. And then they thought about it for a very, very, very long time. And eventually, that's when, and then it was 2 years after that until the book was published.
And so you were working with them for about a year with your manuscript, and then there was another year from the time the manuscript was confirmed to the time you actually got the box at your house. So for most people, it's like at least 2 years from like a standard book. Sam, was it any different in terms of poetry? How did that work for you?
It was actually kind of very similar timeline. So after Jen had approached me, and so poets typically are unagented unless you're, you know, in multiple genres, and maybe you are agented for your novels and they'll let you tag along with your poetry in there or whatever, or you're like a big prize winner. But when you're submitting to the indie presses, usually it's just the poet and then the press. And so getting an editor who was interested was a really big step, because that meant I could expedite the process a little bit, but it's still pretty slow, just because of all of the steps. And so for Attic Rain, we had that connection in 2022, it was at the Fold, and then I gave the full, which I had ready. So that was the other thing. If you say you have a full ready, make sure you have a full ready, so that if you get asked, you're not like, never mind. So I sent it right away. And she had to sit with it for a while, read it. And at that time she said, yeah, I'm interested in it, because there was no guarantee. It was like, let me look and see if we could work together. And then we went through actually a round of editing together to get it in a shape where we thought this is the best foot forward we can show the rest of the press to say, let's accept this. And so I got my acceptance from New West in 2023, and then the book came out in 2024. So fairly similar actually to the timeline you had, Denise.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd say it very similar. Like after that meeting, it was still like a number. It wasn't like immediate, like yes, it couldn't be published. It was still a number of months before the publishers are busy. They are promoting their current books. They're doing all kinds of things. So it does take time. And yeah, a number of months later, and then even then, like when you signed the deal, it was I think it was like a year and a half or so, like in advance. So yeah, everything in publishing takes a while. And I'll say that for picture books, everything takes even longer because the illustrator, if you're not illustrating yourself, the illustrator needs that time as well. So yeah, it's a similar type time frame. I should mention I didn't have an agent for my first book. I was agented, but I had the two picture books. So it can be done like I've done it both ways. They both have advantages, and like depends how I guess familiar you are with like contracts and all of that type of stuff. And agent, it is nice to have someone like they're representing you and putting your best interest at heart. And they obviously take a percentage, and so yeah, both ways can be done. I didn't have, as I said, I didn't have an agent for the first deal I signed.
Well, that's a really good lead into a question about that we often get with Pitch Perfect. So none of you went through the Pitch Perfect stage, I don't think, for any of your manuscripts, but for Pitch Perfect, which the deadline is coming up end of January. If you're watching this in May, we do it every January, so don't worry. We open it up in December. It closes late January, early February. So I always encourage people who are working on books and thinking about getting them published. It's such a great opportunity to be able to talk to someone who would actually potentially take you on in a very casual, low risk situation where they're just going to offer their feedback. You can take it, you can ignore it, you can use it, or they may be interested and take it right there on the spot. But it's really just eyes on it before you enter into the slush pile, so you really know what you're working with. But one of the questions we get a lot is people have a choice between an agent or an editor. Having an agent look at their manuscripts or an editor look at their manuscript. Would you recommend one or the other?
I'd probably say like if you have an editor in mind that you really love the authors that they like the books that they put out, then go for that. If there's an agent who's representing authors you really like, then go for that. I'd probably say it depends on
They won't know if it's who it is. They
oh,
just
okay, they won't know who it
ask
is.
agent or editor. What they do is they'll say like their genre, and then they'll say agent or editor, and then we sort of curate a lineup of agents and editors based on the number of asks and applications.
I'd probably say either is great. Like I wouldn't probably recommend one or the other. I've gone both ways, but you can be successful in both routes. Like if you find an editor who really loves your book, like they're already interested, and that's always a good thing.
Yeah, I feel like the editor that I worked with felt like an agent in a way. I think because your relationship with them is so is really based on the work itself and how much they want to kind of put your book forward, and you find that one person who fell in love with your story. And so agents kind of work in the same fashion. They're not going to work with you if they don't feel they're the best individual to sell your work. And I'm at a very early stage of the agenting experience, so I don't know it all the way through. But thus far, that's been my experience. It feels very similar in terms of that kind of relationship that you're building.
Yeah, and maybe I'll say that, I mean, I've only worked with an editor, not an agent, but because of the poetry process, if you're going for submitting to an indie press, probably whatever you feel is going to get you feedback is in the way that's going to support the stage that you're at in your journey is the way to go. And I think if it was me, I don't want to speak for anyone else because folks might be doing different things, but I would lean towards if I can get an editor to help me workshop this, then I know for poetry, realistically, I'm unlikely to go through an agented submission. So I'll probably steer myself in the direction that aligns more with that publishing process track. And anytime I've gotten feedback on the journey of this has been a gift, because it's rare with the unsolicited slush pile, because there's just so many things for them to read, right? And so anytime I've had notes come back to me, it's been amazing to see some feedback that can help me understand where I am. And I will say, like, I got resourceful in cobbling together, how do I build this team for myself, since poets tend to be doing a lot of these things direct and on their own at the beginning, especially. And so one of the first things I did when I got my book contract was I reached out to amazing book coach Shalene Knight and booked a session to get some advice, right? And then I had my editor and I had this session, and then I looked up to other folks who could give me advice. And so I sort of assembled, how do I think I can get these different mentoring and coaching experiences and put them together for myself from people I really trust or look up to, because I know that for me, I won't have some of the things that tend to match up with the other genres.
I love that. I think too, it made me think when I think about agent versus editor, agents and editors do not come at me for this. This is just my personal opinion. I'm just putting it out on the internet. But I think of agents more from a business perspective and editors more from the craft perspective. Obviously, each side can do a little bit of each. Of both, but you'll find your agent is going to give you very business oriented advice. This is how I would fix your query letter. This is how I would adjust the opening pages so that there's like a drive and there's impact. Whereas your editor is going to be looking at like, what is the story? Where is it going? On a craft level. So depending on where you're at with your manuscript or what you think you want to know, like, am I ready to pitch this to agents? Am I ready to put this out there? Or, I know I'm not ready. Can you tell me how to get it ready? Or like, what's going on? That made me, from what Denise and Sam and Derek, you all shared, made me think of it on those two sides. And obviously I've benefited from both type of advice. So you can go in it and say either or is fine with me. I'll take any advice I can get, because it's really useful that way. So, I wanted to talk about your experiences writing as well, and going through the traditional publishing experience. I should mention we are going to have a self-publishing panel at the Fold as well. So you can watch this, but you can also get some insight on that process. From a traditional publishing standpoint, what was the hardest part of the publishing process and the writing process for you?
I'll jump in and say, not knowing, you're walking in blind. So this is not a critique. This is more of a topic for people to explore when you're going into the process. They do give you some guidelines. They have some historical documents, probably some legacy documents that have been sitting around for a couple of years, that they'll say, this is what you can expect to happen over the next 2 years. But no one really sits down and goes through an introduction with you from the publisher. Not that that's their responsibility, I want to be clear. And so when you walk into it, they'll hand you off to an editor. That was my experience. But then I didn't hear from my editor for weeks. And then I got a question from the publisher saying, how's the editing going? There's no editing happening. So that was my first realization. Don't assume that the connections are happening on the other end. This is just like work. Someone may have dropped the ball somewhere, or the communication wasn't wasn't as smooth as you may have anticipated. So just don't just assume that someone else is taking care of things. Be active and engaged and proactively inquire about the process.
That's so true. I should mention we are going to take questions in a little bit. So start putting your questions in the question and answer box, because that'll tell me how much time to leave for your questions. But it's so true. A lot of things that you do, you assume that someone's going to take care of, your tour or whatever. Like, you make a lot of assumptions about things, and usually they're wrong. And it's a little bit of a dysfunctional process, I find. And the longer I've been in it, the more I've started to take on myself in some ways. What about you, Derek or Sam? Any lessons learned?
Yeah, I think just one general thing to keep in mind is your goal is to find the right home for your book. Like that's what you're trying to do. And there's many ways to like look at or like find that. For like Coconut Dreams, I think of a book called Press as it was just it felt like the right home. That book in particular, I they had an editor in house. It's an independent press, and they had an editor in house. But a lot of that book deals with like these two kids experiencing racism, and I really wanted an editor of color, and I made that known, and Jay and Hazel were like wonderful about it. They went out and got an editor of color for me. Like back in that time was there were fewer editors of color, and so yeah, it just made the world of a difference to be able to do that, and I'm so happy that I went through that. I think of like 100 chapatis. I had a publisher interested, and the book is about a boy Simon and his grandpa waiting for the call from the hospital for a new baby, and they make 100 chapatis together in that time, and but the publisher was interested, but they wanted to make it about like this like they couldn't do like the new sibling type book. Just from the press, they couldn't do it, but they said, "How about we make it about like a chapati making contest or like this?" I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that could be a good book, but that's not really this book here." And so I ended up not going. It's a great publisher, and I have friends who publish there too, but it wasn't the right home for that particular book. And so I ended up finding a publisher, Alkits, who like loved the manuscript as it was and saw like the potential in it. So again, it's really about finding the right home for your particular book, and it could be different manuscripts could have different homes and different editors, and yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely echo that, and I think I feel very spoiled because everything was very smooth in my experience. And I was really thankful for that because I mean, my book's about OCD, living with OCD, but there's also these moments, sort of what Denise hinted at there, where it seems very quiet and then there's a flurry of activity. And so this sort of start and stop of like, there's a long timeline, but then there's like a frenzy of stuff that's needs to be done quickly at certain stages can really activate that anxiety for me. And so one of my challenges was just being like, okay, how do I read the email and then figure out how am I going to do the next step and not feel overwhelmed, sleep on it. If I need more time, how do I ask for an extra few days? Having that open communication. I also found like I love small presses in general as a reader, but also I was so pleased to publish with one. And one of the big benefits, I know this is questions about challenges, but one of the big benefits is that I got to be involved in so many aspects of the book. I got to see some of the prototypes for the cover design, and all these things were so special and important to me. So I feel like a challenge in general for, poets and the industry is there are not that many small presses that publish poetry. And so it can feel really tempting to just jump into the first thing that's offered to you. But I totally agree. The right home for the book is like what you need. And if your intuition is telling you something is strange, it's good to listen because things can fall apart or happen in weird ways. Even if you're not quite sure what it is about it, you can get a feeling for like something about this isn't working or doesn't feel right. And so I think that matching up and taking your time to go through the steps and make sure you can collaborate together is really important.
Love that. I find that to be true for authors from marginalized communities in particular, the kind of like thoughtfulness and care you have to take with your work in each project. I don't know. I've always felt that personally, and I know we talk about it a lot at Fold. It's just like you have to take care of yourself. You have to protect yourself and your story. And when you're going into spaces that are not always, you're not always represented there or not always understood in every way, you have to really like guard that carefully, because you're going to have to defend, explain, do all the things. I think that the things you've all sort of shared about, due diligence and careful steps, and step one and then step two, and maybe no and maybe yes, or are very much consistent with what we've seen over the last 10 years of doing Fold, especially as it relates to authors from marginalized communities. We have a couple questions that I'm going to turn to after this question, and it's because I wanted to hear a little bit from each of you on this note of being writers about, and it's sometimes a question I ask at the beginning. I love that it's going to be the last question. I want to know why you write. We've talked about how you got into writing, but I would love to know why you write, what it provides for you in all the struggles that you have faced, that you likely will face. Like, what is it that writing brings you? Um, Anybody want to start with this very light and easy question?
I can, I guess. I think, well, one of the first reasons is just I feel compelled to do it. I think no matter what happened to me, I would figure out a way to write or engage with literature in some way. But I think it reminds me that I'm curious and creative. Sometimes I worry like I won't have enough original ideas, whether it's in my writing or in my work as a scientist or whatever. But the more I write, the more I realize I actually have a lot of questions. I have a lot, I wonder about the world. I want to explore this next, or wouldn't it be cool if I could do this? And so I find that it really helps me find my own curiosity, and it just fuels a creativity that then extends to everything in my life. So I find it a real energy generator, that sort of sustains me through some of the other activities I have to do that feel more like work and less lighthearted, even though my writing topics tend to be heavy. So
I'm with you, Sam. I write the saddest, depressing, like deep, dark things, but it brings me like so much peace.
yeah, I'm like, I'm having a great time writing this, and
I'm
people are
having
like,
a great
wow.
time. I love killing characters. It's like my favorite thing to do, So I appreciate you mentioning the joy of, like, even in the writing that's a little bit heavier.
Yeah, I can jump in, Samantha. That was actually, I'm glad that when we talk about this amongst ourselves that we find the commonalities in the reasons why we write. And they tend to be really simple. Like, you just feel like it's something, you have a drive to do it, and it's not for monetary gain or anything else. What I've discovered after I've really committed to writing is a truer version of myself. That's what I found, as a result. And I continue to do it as something where I feel like, this is my offering to the world. I can't do a lot of stuff, but I can do this thing, and if I can do it well, then maybe it will be the contribution that I make that will be a part of my legacy. That's what I'm hoping.
Oh, I love both those answers. Mine is not going to be as nearly as
You do it for the money, Derek. Just
yeah.
admit it.
You know what? It's interesting because when I teach and I talk, I do like I save the class about like publishing for the end, and I try and focus on craft for most of the earlier classes. And when I start the publishing discussion always about like, remember, like, why are you writing, like, why that, try and keep that in mind, when, because all of this publishing is this like big machine, and there's so much to it, and it's really complex, and there's all these things like you're doing interviews and you're doing like festivals and there's lists and there's awards and there's all of this noise and stuff, but always try and like remember like why are you writing, like who are you writing for, like make sure it's like for yourself and your community. And that's like if you start with that and you keep that in mind, you almost have to like guard that against all of that other stuff that kind of distracts you from that, and keep in mind like why you write and why and who you're writing for, and yeah, if you keep that in mind, then it'll be its own reward, and it'll bring you joy. That's I guess the short of it.
Yeah, maybe I can just say one more quick thing on that, because we've all talked about this like being authentic piece. Before this book, in and earlier in my writerly journey, I was trying to write what I thought I should write. That would be, and we know that if it's a trend, it's already past the time, right? But when I just forgot about that and found the joy, the reception to my work was so much better. And so I think it's this interesting place, because if you're actually doing it for yourself, I think you attract that energy and other people around you just organically. So I hope that happens for other folks as well.
Agreed.
So we're going to move into the question and answer period, and I'm going to take a 2-minute commercial to answer a bunch of these in one lump, because a couple of them are questions specific to Pitch Perfect and the application process. So the application process is open. There's no restriction if you're not living in Canada to apply, but I will say typically when we make cutoffs, the first cutoffs we make is to focus on Canadian authors who, you might be living outside of Canada right now, but who have some connection to Canada because of our grants, because of all sorts of things. So you don't have to be Canadian to pitch, but it is important. There is a link on our website. I think it's thefoldcanada.org/pitch perfect, where the most detailed and the best information is. But generally speaking, you're going to submit a query letter, and I think something like the first 20 pages of a completed manuscript. And it can be anything from young adult to adult. It can be creative nonfiction or fiction or short fiction. I think those are the parameters, but double check if I did that right. That the whole point is for you to submit a query letter, a synopsis, and the first 20 pages of a completed manuscript. And then you're able to indicate whether you'll have an agent or editor. And then the agent or editor is assigned to you. And usually each agent or editor will have about 4 people assigned to them. And they'll book a virtual meeting with you between April 1st and May 15th-ish, somewhere around that. So every year that cycle is the same. Applications open up in December, close end of January. You submit the same things. Eventually, if you're selected, you're connected to someone, and then those meetings happen in April and May. So that answers a couple of the things, and they're all virtual. So you don't have to be in Brampton. It's a Zoom meeting, all that good stuff. So I'm going to go to a question that was asked about marginalized, for those of you, in terms of addressing marginalized communities and your concerns. Did you have any concerns going into the publishing process about your identity, who you are, what you're writing about, and how did you address them in the publishing process? Derek, you shared about asking specifically for an editor of color. Does anybody else have a similar circumstances where you're like, this is my worry, this is how I'd like it to be kind of addressed?
I had a worry about, I wanted to ensure that because I was writing about a neighborhood that is a housing development, that it wasn't interpreted the wrong way, if that makes any sense. I wasn't trying to punch down on this beautiful community that I knew, that my family dwelled in, that gave us shelter at different points in our lives. And I wanted to show the joy. And so I was concerned that maybe someone may try to steer the perspective differently, or try to curtail the positivity in the work, just because sometimes people feel like readers are looking for a certain thing, and when publishers are not thinking about the creative piece and they're thinking more about the business. Luckily, with indie publishers, as Samantha you mentioned, I find that might not be much of an issue for us. It was a beautiful experience overall, and I really didn't have to make many changes or deal with the kind of questions that might be that might cause a bit of conflict when it comes in the editing process, language being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, that was also another concern, that someone would ask me to change the dialect.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have that experience, so I was very grateful for that. But I know
And was
others
your
have.
editor BIPOC or?
No, she wasn't.
Mm.
However, she has had experience working with BIPOC authors.
Mm.
Yeah.
Really important.
She was excellent. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And I guess there's kind of two things that I experienced, and neither of them were bad. They were just things to think about. And the first was, I was really preoccupied with, will people read this book and take it as advice and then go do something that's not right for them and their mental health? And so I was very and I think I was entering into an OCD loop about that in my own thinking and being very worried about it. And so I did a lot of thinking and chatting with my editor as well about, how can I present this in a way that's like, this is my experience that I'm sharing with you, but I'm not saying there's one way or another to do it. I want everyone to be well in the way that's right for them. And so I was really thankful that we got to have those discussions, and that I did have that bit of time over the course of, these 2 years of everything happening, to think about, how do I do this right? And then the other thing that was very weird for me, and it's still strange, and it's nothing to do with the actual book, but it's the way that books get categorized. As a person that's a mixed race person, love labels. Probably if you ask folks who have different ethnicities, they have something to say about check boxes and labels, but your books get different labels. And depending on the country, like if you look up my book in the US, it's an African American book. And in Canada, and I told my press, I'm both Black Canadian and white settler. So you put those both on my thing, either is fine or both. But I recognize in different countries that gets labeled different ways in their systems. And so my Black family came from, the US, New York, and Maryland, like many hundreds of years ago. But I don't describe myself as an African American person. So I'm looking at the label being like, is this fine? Is this not? And I'm like, just don't worry about it. It's fine. People will understand that you are describing yourself one way in a Canadian context, and then in the industry, the labels might look a little bit different, and it's all right. And so I had to let go of that self-consciousness and be like, some of these things are not up to me. I didn't make up the labels, and it's okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I appreciate you sharing that. One of the questions that I think is a really good one for you guys in particular, because all of you did your first book deals unagented. Sorry, it's a question from T Santos, who says, my question is, what resource did you use, if any, for reviewing your book contracts, especially when unagented? Thanks in advance. Thank you for asking.
I know so the Writers Union does have like a guide to I think like contracts with publishers, and you can I think there's a fee to it if you're not a Writers Union member, but you can I use that, and it was like, because it kind of gives like the general rate for different and general percentages that you want to look for. That's a good place. I kind of had a couple of friends who had similar time frames, and like so I compared literally like compared contracts, and then like, oh, these percentages similar, or so you can sometimes do that. But I do know, like, if you don't have an agent and you want to there's that Writers Union document that does have like just the general percentages. Not all of them. Maybe with an agent, maybe an agent is fighting for a higher percentage on a certain ones. You don't know that without an agent, but as a baseline, that's a decent start. Yeah.
And most time, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in addition to that, when I hired a book coach, that for me, just that session, we were able to talk about what things should I look for in contracts, not just in terms of the monetary amounts that are in some of those guides, but are there certain clauses I should keep an eye out for where I might not be able to do something with, an audiobook rights, or I have to do something with my next book, or what are all these things and am I okay with them or not? And so that was helpful to just get a feel for what might be included and what to keep an eye out for. So that's useful as a thing you can do as well if you want to bring in someone as a freelance to coach you.
Mhm. You can sometimes go to things like Surrey's Writers Conference has a really good like blue ribbon panels where you can just jump in with an agent and ask those types of questions. One term you'll hear a lot is a boilerplate contract, which is what indie publishers will explain is like, this is the contract we give all of our authors. It doesn't change. It doesn't move. It's like, it's the same thing. The amount may change, but like all the other contingencies are typically similar and don't move. Or they'll say it's boilerplate and these are the only things where you can kind of negotiate. And so it's I think understanding the negotiables, and understanding also just maybe they get world rights no matter what, understanding what that means and how that impacts, future books by talking to other authors and saying, did you give up world rights? Did you just give up Canadian rights? What are the benefits? Those are the hardest parts.
Can I just add maybe that also like if you get an offer and you're not comfortable with the contract side, like you can always go to an agent then with and like with going to an agent with an offer in hand is much different than going to an agent like with your manuscript, because they'll like a lot of their job is trying to sell it, and if you've already have an offer from a publisher, then a lot of a portion of the job is done. So if you aren't comfortable with that, and you could go to an agent at that point, and try and get them done.
Okay, so this is one that I'll just answer really quickly. Rose asked, so I asked, it's about, is it possible for previously self-published books to be picked up by traditional publishers later? How would the process go? Would the self-published versions need to be taken down and replaced? I'll start by saying, and you guys can tell me if I'm wrong or if there's things I'm missing, but typically no. If you self-publish, you're not able to publish it traditionally afterwards. Most agents, most publishers are just like, no. So you do have to make that decision up front. There's a lot of pressure to go one way or another oftentimes, and it's much like finding a publisher. I think you got to figure out what's right for your book and your journey in writing. But it's really, really important to do that obviously early enough that you can make both decisions and you're not, self-publishing and then wanting to get it traditionally published, because it's not the way that it's done typically. Did anybody have anything to add to that one? I just thought I would cross that one off the top. Okay. This one is about touring. Could you speak to your experience to arrange for touring, especially for nonfiction and poetry? Do you have a publicist, or is there press? How does it work for doing local or traveling events? This is a great question because I think it is the mystical part of publishing. Some things I'm curious if you guys thought one way before your book came out and now you understand it differently. What are your answers to this question? And did you learn anything about it? Anybody? Denise, yeah.
I didn't tour. I assumed, because I can be somewhere between pessimistic and realist, that it's coming out of my pocket, right? So I never had to travel for my novel, and some of the places that I showed up on my own, like just my own want and desire to connect, or it was just a very authentic desire to be somewhere. So I don't really have an answer for you, but I do know in other circumstances that sometimes, depending on the arrangement between your agent, if you have an agent, and the publisher and where it's happening and the festival organizers, that sometimes you have to get yourself there first and you expense it. And other times they might be able to give you a stipend. I share that as a part of other people's experience, not my own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll say for poetry, so a couple of things. Small presses and poets aren't known for their cross-country book tours. So I've been doing events, but I've been creative about how to make it into a book tour. And some of those events are arranged and pitched by the press. I do have a person that I work with who is, the marketing specialist at New West, and they are focused on the season that's just come out and the one that's coming up. And so they're going to be pitching you to festivals or reading series. And a lot of the presses will give you a really detailed questionnaire about all of the things that you would like to do. So I filled in this thing with like, these are all my dream festivals. These are all my ideas for where I might be able to, go back to my hometown in Nova Scotia, and I could probably like set something up next time I visit for family, right? And so just thinking about what kind of synergies with things that I'm already doing might exist. Because there's
Did they bring that questionnaire to you, or was that things that you kind of just told them?
They give the questionnaire to me. So that was like the welcome questionnaire, which was very thorough. So that was great because I got to have a lot of input really far in advance. And then if I saw something I thought might align, I had a focal that I could email it to and say, hey, look, you might be on this already, but this could work. But then for actual events, like for my launch, which I did as a double launch with my friend Kirti Badresa, who has a new book with ECW. We did a Calgary launch, and then our presses covered that for us. But then also, I would go to Edmonton and say, hey, can I expense my bus ticket or whatever? And then other things I've done, like recently I went to Red Deer. I just did that myself to do another event with Kirti. So there's a combo of those things. You can apply for grants. And for poets, if you're a full member of the League of Canadian Poets, there are fundings you can apply for book events and things. I'm not totally up to date on all the details, but it's worth looking into because you can start to get creative about how you might assemble your little book tour on your own with a combo of funding from different places.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, I agree with a lot of what has been said. It depends on like a bit of like what you get, like the publisher pitches at festivals and what you get invited to, and then also like what you kind of want to do with your book. And like I know on the kidlit side, on the picture books, it's more the like libraries and schools and like education market, so that there's not so much a focus on like a book launch. But I really wanted to do one for mine, and I thought that was important, so I did one. But it was a lot of organizing for myself. But so yeah, it's a bit of a combo of what comes your way, but then also what you want to what's important to you. What do you want to do with your book?
A lot of it is good to do like at least 6 months before your book is coming out in terms of planning and strategizing, and even asking your publisher if you're not getting answers about it 6 months ahead of your book coming out. Like that's when you want to panic or push harder. You don't want to wait till the book is coming out or a month after, because oftentimes the publishers are like starting on the next season of books. So just understanding that timing, I think, is really important too. There are a few questions in the chat I'm going to answer quickly. Some of them are not able to be answered quickly, and we have run out of time. Children's books, we do a Pitch Perfect specific to children's books. The applications for that open up in August. It's a similar kind of time frame in that the festival happens in November, and that's when the pitches happen. And same thing, picture books, middle grade, young adult. We've had a couple of really amazing authors come through the Pitch Perfect program specifically. And so there's that. A couple other things that I want to say. There's a question about the Fold magazine. So typically this time of year, we also take applications for poetry or short stories. This year, we're doing a 10th anniversary special. So we're actually picking one piece from all 9 of the previous years, and then just having one article written by a special guest for this year's magazine. So that application won't be open this year, but stay tuned for more in the future. Any questions from you 3 before I wrap up? Okay, don't leave anybody, because I have important information that you're going to want to here. So first of all, Pitch Perfect applications are open now. They close end of January. Head to thefoldcanada.org/pitch perfect for details and information. If I said something that contrasts with what you see on the site, pay attention to the site. Ignore everything I've said on that if it's wrong. The other thing I'll mention is this Saturday, we have our first Fold Academy of 2025. So we have a writing series, a publishing series that we do all year long. We do 6 to 7 events a year, and we do them live. You are emailed the recording if you register and you can't join us live. And then they're also part of the Fold virtual platform in May. So if you're watching this at various points and you're like, oh, I missed this, it was yesterday or 2 weeks ago, you can go first of all to YouTube and catch it there. You can also register for the Fold and you'll be able to find it in the virtual platform as well. The next one is with award-winning author and screenwriter Catherine Hernandez, and she'll be talking to us about natural dialogue. Also, we do a reading challenge every year. If you know about our reading challenge, you can go to thefoldcanada.org/reading challenge or something along those lines. It'll show up. And we are reading together Love, Lies, and Cherry Pie. So you can, if you use Storygraph, which is like Goodreads, you can join our reading chat, our read along, and you can ask questions and chat at various points in the book. So take advantage of that. The last thing I'll say is, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Festival of Literary Diversity. We have a ton of some really cool announcements coming up in the next month. It is going to be a busy 6 months or so for us. So follow us on social media, subscribe to the newsletter, make sure you're subscribed on YouTube. I should remember one more thing. All the things that you've heard talk about, one of the things I would recommend is we have a podcast documenting this 10th anniversary year called Into the Fold. And I would recommend going wherever you listen to podcasts, finding Into the Fold with JL and Hudson Lynn. And a lot of these things that we've talked about have either been talked about on previous podcasts already or are going to be talked about in the podcasts that are coming out over the next few months. So follow Into the Fold, follow Fold. Thank you for joining us live or on demand or on YouTube. We very much appreciate you being here. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions.